There are two color schemes that are easy ways to create a cohesive look. Hi everyone, it's Carol from Discover Interior Design, and I'm so glad you're here. Well, in this video, we're going to be talking about the monochromatic color scheme and the analogous color scheme, and how each of those are easy ways or simple ways to tie everything together in a room. And one thing that's going on in both of these color schemes is that we could almost call them related color schemes because there's something in there that's similar or common that helps to tie everything together. And when we see a room, when we see a home, any sort of color scheme using these types of color combinations, we get a sense of calmness because we can see right away how things are related and how things are uniform and help to tie everything together. So the first color scheme that we're going to talk about is the monochromatic color scheme. When we look at that word, monochromatic color scheme, we can find that the etymology, so the origin of that word, is from the Greek words monos, meaning one, and chroma, meaning color. So with the monochromatic color scheme, we are just working with one color and with different variations of this one color. And with a monochromatic color scheme where we're just using one color, that kind of in a way helps to create a spaciousness in a room because everything is kind of related and it all flows together really easily. The other thing that can happen is that it can help us feel at peace and calm just because we can see right away that there is one main color and different variations of that color, but everything is tied together. It's very easy for us to see that. One of the monochromatic color schemes that we like to use is something where we would use a neutral color. And when I speak about a neutral color, I'm referring to those colors like white and cream and black and gray and earth tones like beige and tan and brown. So when we start out with a neutral color scheme, there are things that we want to make sure we do with the different colors in a room or in our home to make sure it looks really great. So when you want to just have one color as the main color scheme in a room or in your home, there are a couple things to keep in mind so that it looks and feels great. First of all, you start out with a main color, and when you decide that, you want to think about what is the look and feel that you're going for. That main color is going to kind of set the tone for everything. And whether you want your room to look and feel kind of soft and very calming, or maybe a little bit more energetic with more contrast. So that's where you want to kind of think about that and start with a color, that one color that's going to set the tone for the room. And the other thing that's important to think about with using just one color is that you want to make sure there is some variation. So creating variety and contrast in the room so that your room or your home is dynamic and not the opposite of maybe being kind of flat or dull. So one of the first things that we would want to do is make sure that we use different variations of value of that color. And value just has to do with how light or dark something is. And so what I would recommend doing is thinking about that, say, just in one room where you would have different lightness and darkness variations of that main color. And maybe you could just keep in mind a really simple way of just making sure you have three different variations, maybe having a darker version, a lighter version, and then maybe a mid-tone or something in between. And then that way throughout your room, you will see different variations of light and dark tones, and it just makes that space feel dynamic. And the other thing you'd want to think about is saturation, which just has to do with how intense a color is. And when we're thinking of neutral colors, Usually that means, say, if we're working with earth tones and beiges and tans and browns, that means that they're not very saturated, because those original colors, if they were very pure and very saturated, they may start out from a very bright, deep orange. But when we use them in a neutral version of a color scheme, that means we're probably toning down that saturation and that intensity. But that doesn't mean that we can't still vary that a little bit. So maybe having some different variation of intensity in different areas of the room will help to create some nice contrast, and even just in a subtle way or a big way, but just to create some variety in the space where you have different levels of saturation. And you would want to keep in mind, the more saturated a color is, even if it is a neutral color, the more intense that's going to look to us, and it's going to grab our attention a little bit more. So if you want to keep things kind of soft, you may want to just use just a little bit of a more saturated version of those colors, or maybe just keep everything kind of on the softer side so there isn't this big jump from super saturated to very low saturation. The other thing to think about is proportions. How much you want of these different variations of even just neutral colors. So maybe if you want to keep your room light and bright, maybe you use that lighter version of the neutral color on your wall, but then maybe you get a little bit of a deeper color on the flooring, and then even more darker versions maybe in furniture or bedding or just different things that are going on in the room. So when you bring all of that together, you can see that there's different proportions of all of those different variations, which is really important to create a space that looks and feels great. So with a neutral color scheme, we can use that throughout the entire room, and right away that helps us feel calm and peaceful, just because we can kind of see how everything is related. Another version that we can think of is maybe you have a room where the backdrop, so maybe the walls, the ceiling, the floor, is in neutral colors. All of those areas are in neutral colors, but then you bring in another color that you want to use as your monochromatic color scheme. This is where you'd want to think about proportion and maybe the intensity of a color and contrast and focal areas. So for instance, if we look in this kitchen, we can see, the walls are white, but those cabinets are this deep, intense red. Right away, red is a very bold, warm color that can really grab our attention. But that entire room isn't painted all in red or different variations of red. It's just those kitchen cabinets, which take up a lot of visual weight, which means that we are looking at those kitchen cabinets and noticing those kitchen cabinets right away. And I would say that we could look at that kitchen and say, oh, that's a red kitchen. Even though it's not like everything is painted red or everything is in red, but just because of the placement of that red, the intensity of the red, that's another way to create a monochromatic color scheme. Another variation could be where maybe you have a bedroom that is in neutral colors, but then you decide to paint the accent wall where the bed is, the focal area of the room, in a different color. Well, just because of the importance of that wall, where it has a lot of visual weight to it. It's a lot darker than all of the other colors that are going on in the room, all of the other values that are going on in the room, and plus it has a color to it. It's not a neutral color, it has a bluish, darker tone to it. We can almost call that room, oh, that's the blue room, just because of the importance of that accent wall and that bold color back there. And it also kind of lets our eyes know that that's the dominant color in this room, that we could call that almost like a monochromatic color scheme. And if we think about it, sometimes if we do have a neutral color scheme, sometimes we like to bring in some little other colors, little pops of color everywhere. And I would still consider that a monochromatic color scheme where we're just using neutral colors. And all of those little pops of color are just kind of accent colors. And when you do that, it kind of brings up everything to a different level and adds more variety to your room. So whereas a monochromatic color scheme is just using one color, an analogous color scheme is using two or more colors. And the word analogous comes from the Greek word for proportionate or corresponding to particulars, which just kind of means similar or comparable to something else. So with an analogous color scheme, we are working with two or more colors that are similar to one another, that they have something in common. They are related to one another. And because of that, we can get a sense of seeing those connections when we see those colors together in a room. And that helps us feel calm and helps us feel good because we can see how everything is related. And like a monochromatic color scheme, you can start with just one central color that you really love, and then you want to find colors that look great with that color. Well, how do you figure out which colors are going to go with that color? Well, one thing we can do is take a look at a color wheel. And a color wheel is a tool for us to use to work with colors and find color combinations that go well together. So when we look at a really basic color wheel, which is just limited just to 6 colors, but of course there are all these different variations out there. But this is a nice way just to kind of see those really basic color relatedness and color combinations. And when we look at a color wheel and we say, oh, okay, we want to base a room on the color red. Well, related colors would be on either side of the color red. That would mean orange and purple. And what's happening here is that a color wheel is actually set up in a specific sequence. Colors that are next to each other on the color wheel share something in common. So when we take a look at the color red and take a look at the color orange next to it, well, there's a reason why orange is next to the red. It's because there's red in orange, red and yellow. And then on the other side, if we see purple, well, there's a reason why purple is next to red. It's because there's red and blue in purple. So right away, that combination of colors are related because they all have red in them. And so we could go all the way around the color wheel and start with one main color and just look on either side of that main color and find the colors that relate to that first color that we started with. And all this is creating an analogous color scheme. So those colors that are next to each other are related, but if we look to colors that are opposite certain colors on the color wheel, that's telling us they're not related at all, and that's a lot of contrast. And those combinations can create other types of color schemes that we could refer to almost as contrasting color schemes. An analogous color scheme can be very simple and just start out with just 2 colors that are related, say blue and green. But to create a more dynamic look, it's kind of fun to use that 3 color scheme where we would have a main central color and then the color on either side of that color to create a color scheme or a color palette with 3 colors in it. So like a monochromatic color scheme, we would want to think about maybe a main color that we want to start with. And then we also want to think about how we want our room to look and feel, because that will help us choose the version of that color that will create that look and feel that we want, whether it's kind of soft and calm or more energetic. And look for colors next to it on the color wheel to give us an idea of what colors will go well with that color. And of course, this color wheel is just the basic pure colors, because we could look at color wheels that we could call them kind of expanded, where it's almost like going to the paint store where you can see all these different variations just of the color red or just of the color green. And just to kind of keep that in mind, it doesn't have to be these super pure versions of the color, but it can be. It just depends upon how you want your room to look and feel. And like the monochromatic color scheme, we want to make sure that our analogous color scheme is as interesting and dynamic as possible. One thing that this color scheme has going for it is it's already starting out with 2 or more colors, whereas the monochromatic color scheme we talked about is just starting out with 1. The analogous color scheme will just have more variety right away just because it is really starting out with 2 or more colors. But we also want to think about creating variety through value and saturation again. One thing you could do is just to have each of those colors, either 2 colors or 3 colors, and that each of them has a different value to it. So maybe your main color is a lighter color, whereas the other 2 related colors are in mid-tone or darker values. And the same goes with saturation and intensity. Maybe your main color is the most saturated color, whereas the other 2 colors or the other color you're working with is less saturated. And the other thing that you can keep in mind, because we're working with 2 or more colors, is thinking about color temperature. And color temperature is how we perceive a color to be either on the warm side or on the cool side. So one fun thing you could do is work with both warm and cool colors. So you could work with a blue that's on the cooler side, but with a green that maybe has more yellow in it that's on the warmer side. And so just to kind of keep that in mind, it adds some subtle variation. We can still see that those colors are related, but there's just some nice variety happening with that combination just because of changing up the color temperature. And with an analogous color scheme, we also want to think about proportions. So mixing things up a little bit so that maybe there is one of the colors that you see more of, maybe on those bigger areas in a room or focal areas in a room, and the other color or other colors are in smaller areas of the room. And if you want to bring in some variety to a room where maybe you just have a lot of neutral colors, but in a certain area, maybe you want to bring in some different colors. This is where you could bring in that analogous color scheme just in your bedding or in the draperies or maybe just on a sofa, just different areas in your room where you can bring in that color combination, but just in smaller areas. And when you are thinking of proportions and placement of where you want to place all your different variations of one color or 2 or more colors, think of all the different areas that we have in a room. We have the big visual weight areas of our walls where we may have cabinets and doors and trim, and think of the ceiling and the flooring. Think of all of your different types of furnishings and furniture. Anything that's built in. Also, anything that is attached to our ceiling or to our walls, such as built-in lighting. And think of decor, such as artwork or accessories, and down to the details of the hardware on our doors or the plumbing fixtures. That's where we can use different variations of the color scheme that we're using just to create a dynamic space. And keep in mind, with either of these 2 related color schemes, it's essential to bring in variation into your space. So that just means making sure to use different values and also different types of intensities. And think about proportion and maybe having one color be kind of the dominant color, whereas the other colors can be kind of the supporting colors in a space. So I'd love to find out from you if you have a monochromatic color scheme or even an analogous color scheme in your home or in one of your rooms. And I'd love to find out what colors you chose and how you decided to choose those colors. So share your ideas in the comments and please share if you have any questions. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.